Hi, I'm Jerry from PressureWasher.net. I want to talk about the connections being made to install a hot water pressure washer. On this particular unit, we've got a dual feed system to this pump. What we're doing is taking a larger water supply, like this is a 6.5 gallon a minute pump on this one for 4,000 psi. So we're going to use an 1.25 inch line coming from your water tank, shut off valve, and split it into two 1-inch lines so the water seals have the best chance possible to live a long time. Also, on your filter, there's going to be a garden hose adapter so that you can shut off the ball valve that feeds the system, hook up a garden hose to this, and pressure feed the inlet of the system to make sure there's no leaks. That's also great for troubleshooting. If you were to call me up and say, my pump's not making pressure today and I'm getting pulsating pressure, what do I do? The first thing I'm going to ask you to do is pressure feed this thing to check for leaks. That's first step in troubleshooting a pump. You've got to prove that it's got the perfect water supply, and then we can go on from there. Okay, so this one has dual feed. We got water going to the pump. Now we got the high pressure coming out. This is your pressure regulator for the system. It's the unloader. It actually unloads the pressure against the pump when you let go of the gun. When you open the gun, you get pressure. When you let go of the gun, it should go into a no-load bypass. This is a pressure trapping type unloader. It traps the pressure in the outlet side of the unloader and everything after the unloader. So if there's any leaks in your hose reel or quick couplers, or if the gun is bleeding, your unloader is going to think that the gun opened again and it tries to repressurize. That's not good for the system. It's cycling it more than it needs to be cycled. You want to make sure that the first thing you do whenever you're testing any pump system is make sure that when you open the gun you get pressure. When you let go of the gun, it goes into a no-load bypass. It doesn't sound like the engine is running hard in horsepower just to keep the thing running in bypass. It should be a no-load bypass. Okay, so we've got our high pressure hose connection out here that's going to go from the unloader out to the heater. If we're going to heat that water on your units, you're getting heat, so here you go. So this will be connected to the inlet of the heater, which I'm going to show you in just a minute. This also has a secondary regulator. Okay, by having a secondary regulator, what we're doing is with this valve open right here, it enables a secondary unloader to do the regulating. So this one will go into bypass. Now let's talk about bypass lines real quick. Okay, if one of these is bleeding and it's not supposed to be bleeding, in order to troubleshoot this thing, I'm going to ask you which one of them is bypassing back to the holding tank. Okay, so your return lines back to your tank should be separate. We don't want to run them together, because if we're troubleshooting to figure out why it's not making pressure today, we want to know if that one's bleeding or if this one's bleeding. If you've got that valve closed and we're supposed to be making full pressure and that unloader is bypassing back to the tank, you know that this valve is bad and it's not closing all the way. So think about the functionality in how you're setting the system up to begin with. You've got your primary unloader. It's going to have a bypass line here going back to the holding tank. And if we're going to also use the secondary regulator, then that valve's going to be open and some of the water is going to be bypassing back to the holding tank. And again, it should go into a no-load bypass when you open and close the gun, even at the lower pressure range. Okay, that regulator you can adjust from 1,000 to 2,000 psi, no problem. In fact, I think we put this lower pressure regulator on here so you can go down to 500 psi when you want to have steam. Okay. So you've got an adjustable range that you can mess with this unloader. Just make sure you're paying attention to the nozzle chart and you're matching the nozzles to the flow of your system so that you're not overheating the water. There's going to be a temperature gauge right here on the outlet of your heater that's telling you what it's really doing. So be aware when you're making adjustments to the flow and pressure that it's also going to change your temperature. Got to watch that like a hawk. Okay? So secondary regulator, separate bypass back to the tank. Primary regulator, separate bypass back to the tank. Okay, this is belt drive, This is on a swing arm configuration. You've got 2 bolts here that operate the swing arm. So you want to loosen this and raise the thing up when you want to change the belts or tighten the belts. You just tighten it back down again when you want the belts tight. This is super simple to service. Okay, while we're here looking at hardware, we're going to give you vibration isolators to go underneath the frame so that and there's a rubber piece that comes on top too. We'll send you images along with the instructions so that you can get this mounted correctly. But the idea is, if we have vibration isolation between this frame and the floor that you're bolting it down to, you're not creating an amplifier system out of the body of your truck. And by this thing being able to vibrate without being bolted down rigid, it also keeps this thing from shaking itself apart. So pay attention to the mounting. I'm going to give you grade 8 bolts to go through the floor, so there's no way this can go anywhere when you're if it was in an accident, and everything is still serviceable. You'll have to mount this in a configuration that you can get to everything. We want a little bit of space each direction around it. We don't want the muffler to be more than, we don't want it to be any closer, I should say, than about 6 or 8 inches from a plastic siding on your truck or a water tank or something like that. So be very careful that you've got the exhaust away from the wall and away from anything that could melt. And if it needs to be wrapped with some kind of insulation, I have a thick ceramic wool insulation blanket that we can provide. We can actually make panels. So if this muffler has to be within 6 inches, we can make a nice insulating panel to put on the wall of your truck that protects the wall from the heat coming off of this. The exhaust needs to get out of the enclosure. You'll have to plumb that as intelligently as you can. You can route it through the heater exhaust and go straight up through the roof, as long as you're paying attention to the fact that this will put out 1200 degree exhaust, whereas the heater exhaust is only about 900 degrees. So be aware that if you're going to add the engine exhaust to the heater exhaust, it's going to be quite a bit hotter, and you got to make sure your insulation is good going through the roof. So be really careful with that. You've got a great big charging system on this unit. It has an actual circuit breaker that's heat shrunk in here. It's an automatic resetting circuit breaker, but if you ever had any trouble with your charging system, the first question would be is if the regulator is actually is actually good and the breaker is what's actually bad. So you might have to stab the wire to check the voltage coming out of it if you're not getting any power to your, on the other side of the circuit breaker. So just be aware that this is actually a circuit breaker right here. I normally put a fuse on these things, but it came with a 50 amp circuit breaker because this is a bigger than usual charging system. Okay, the engine controls are pretty simple. You got your electric start right here. You get your throttle control here. It's a regular carbureted style engine, so we've got good something that's very easy to service and keep alive. Okay, you got plenty of charging system to run the heater. What we're going to do with the heat is we're going to run it off the battery that also powers the electric start engine. That great big charging system is going to keep the battery charged so you can run the heater. I've got great big cables, big wire here. There's a fuse to protect our heater system. Just wire this to the battery, wire that to the battery with the big cables, and this thing will live a long time and it'll be reliable. Okay, the heater is going to have some fuel lines coming from the fuel pump. The one that goes to the filter right here is going to be your suction side line. It's going to suck the fuel in through the filter, and what fuel it does not use will be returned to the tank through the return line. Okay, so pretty simple. It can draw fuel uphill, not a big deal, from a pretty good distance. Which reminds me, I've got an electric fuel pump that's going on that engine as well, because you're going to have your fuel tank for the gas engine down below. That engine can't suck the fuel uphill as easily as this can. So that one needs an electric fuel pump to boost the fuel from your fuel tank up to where the engines are. But the diesel fuel, it can draw from a distance, not a problem. Okay, now you've got you've got a fuel pressure gauge on here that indicates the fuel pressure. When you flip on the heater, whenever you're going to run the system, you're going to turn the heater on and observe that it sounds like the air is blowing. You don't have fire yet because you didn't open the gun. The fuel pressure is going to read between 100 and 120 psi. That's pretty standard. It'll always be the same pressure every time you flip on the switch. If it ever acts differently, you've got a problem. Okay, so we've got good fuel pressure, and when you turn the switch on, it sounds like it should be normal, and it should run fine. It'll always sound the same way. After you test to make sure that the heater sounds normal, then you go start your pressure washer and you make sure the pressure is making, the pump's making good pressure. Then you turn on the heater and observe that when you open the gun, you get good pressure, and the flame comes on. Flame comes on, no smoke, none at all. You let go of the gun, the flame goes off, no smoke, okay? Pump goes into a no load bypass, life is good. If you turn down the temperature control, the heater should shut off even with the gun open. You turn it up and you should be good. Remember, this is a high limit switch. You're going to set this for the maximum temperature that you're trying to use. Your temperature gauge is going to be right here. Never set the temperature for more than you're expecting. If you want 120 degrees and that's all you want, then only turn it to 120. If you want 200, turn it to 200. If you have it set too high, then what's going to happen is your high limit switch is beyond the range of the way it's normally supposed to be working. So if the heater stays on, it's going to stay on longer than it needs to be staying on. So be aware of the function. It should always work the same way. Call us if you have any questions.